even though I gave them this out of, look, you've been tricked. Now you don't have to be tricked anymore. They've gone full on logging industry disinformation or complete cover-up, such as there has still, to this day, 2 years later, not been a single mention, not a single line in a single article anywhere in Colorado about the biggest logging project, it seems, in Colorado history, certainly of the century. Welcome, Wild Ones. This is Josh Schlossberg, host of the Green Root Podcast, the official podcast of Eco Integrity Alliance, where we're on a quest to uncover the roots of the ecological crisis. We have gone past 100 episodes with the Green Root Podcast, big deal. And at this point, for the next 100, I want to intersperse a little more of me ranting. Well, it's not going to be that exactly. I'm going to do some solo flights where I talk about topics that maybe I'm too lazy to write about. I'm actually a better writer than I am speaker, because with writing you can go back and you can refine and you can have information and links. Speaking, I just say words and hope they come out okay. But you know what? I get to be lazy sometimes. And the truth of the matter is, I just think this might be a good format for getting certain topics out there and hopefully engaging folks. And that's what I'm trying to do. So we'll see how successful this is. If you really hate me talking to you, you can, of course, leave at any time, or you can message me and say, please stop and have more guests. But I'm going to still have guests every 2 weeks. Maybe I'll do these every other week in between, maybe once a month. Maybe never, ever again. We'll see how this goes. I used to do a little bit more of these, and honestly, I stopped only because I had issues with my recording equipment. But here we go. I want to talk about this topic: anti-environmental media, inept or corrupt. Now, I'm probably going to talk more about this in the future. I've certainly talked about this plenty in the past, written about it, definitely going to be writing about it more. But here's why this sticks in my craw. So I started as an environmental advocate years ago. Then I actually started doing environmental journalism. So without going into the details that nobody cares about, I was an advocate. Then I did advocacy journalism, which is you have a perspective, but you definitely document everything and you're not fabricating things, and it's certainly not just opinion. And then I moved into what I call legit balanced journalism. I was a freelancer for a lot of media outlets in Colorado, nationally and internationally, and I won some awards. I don't think that matters. I think actually my best articles were ignored, but whatever. And so I do have a background in that. And why did I get out of journalism? I got out of journalism because I realized pretty much all journalists, and certainly their editors and the publishers, are advocates, as in they're doing advocacy and pretending we're getting a variety of spectrums. And I was like, if we're going to do advocacy, I might as well just do advocacy. And I feel like when media does advocacy without acknowledging that it's a kind of advocacy media, I think advocacy media is fine. But ones that pretend to be, we're getting a variety of views and we're going to not have a pre-decided narrative, I think it's extremely dishonest to actually be advocates and pretending that you're not. So I decided I'm going to get out of this and I'm just going to go back to advocacy and include some journalism, advocacy journalism, in what I'm doing. And so my job has been to interface with media. Right? I have been communicating with journalists. You think, okay, I understand how the sausage is made. I know how to put together a press release. I know what information they're likely to pay attention to, what they're not, what their beats are, all that sort of stuff. And I have been pretty blown away at, how do I frame this? How terrible media has been at covering environmental topics. Now, I do want to be clear, not all journalists are like this. There are definitely plenty of journalists who do a good job most of the time, and some who do a good job sometimes. So what happened here in Colorado, where I've been living and working on public lands issues, primarily ecosystem advocacy, is that they weren't covering topics, and then I would bring it to their attention, and some of them would sort of cover it, not so great, and then they got real bad at it, and then they stopped covering it altogether. And I've just been trying to make sense of all this. Now, I'm not going to get into all the minutia of what specifically happens and the details. It's just like, you don't care. I don't feel like recounting all that to you right now. But let me have some broad strokes here. So I'm trying to figure out if they're just bad at their jobs and can't write these stories properly, or they're pretty good at their jobs of propaganda. So that's why it's like inept or corrupt. But to start with, I think one of the limitations is simply that these media outlets are dying, and so they don't necessarily have the resources and time to really write real pieces. So they either don't cover something or they just do a really quick run through. Now, we can blame the internet. You can blame a lot of things. I actually blame just bad journalism. Like, who wants to read that stuff when we all know it is distorted and full of omissions and propaganda anyway? Might as well just pick your favorite propaganda outlet and listen to that than pretend you're getting a whole variety of views by some folks who are honestly trying to get out information without an agenda. So I think they destroyed themselves, but I think that's a piece of it, right? They're not able to get to these stories. They consider them maybe sometimes a little too complex. And here is where the next piece comes into play. Well, why do they consider them complex? Because they're not scientifically literate and environmentally literate, which, okay, a journalist is not expected to know everything about everything. In fact, that's not their job at all. It's to have a good enough understanding, at least really to ask good questions, and then say, all right, what does this person say? Okay, here's somebody from the government. Here is an environmental advocate. Maybe here's someone who's a middle of the road advocate. Here's someone who's maybe more hardcore. A variety of perspectives. Let's get industry in there. I'm personally a fan of media getting all perspectives, as many as perspectives as possible. I know a lot of people will actually crap on that idea and say, oh, that's both sides journalism. Well, that's what they're supposed to do, right? And we're not talking about, oh, okay, what does this neo-Nazi have to say? Let's really get into their point of view too. Okay, there are obviously some limits to that, but within the realm of sanity and normalcy, pretty much every environmental advocate, their perspective should be incorporated, and they tend not to. Again, I think a lot of this stuff has to do with media not being able to make sense of this information because, yes, they don't have the ability to do so, but they can work on that. They can learn more about science. If their beat is environmental issues or things that tie into that, guess what? Read a little bit more science. Listen to YouTube videos describing scientific concepts, making some efforts. Read actual books. Talk to more scientists. Get better at your job. If you're not able to cover these topics, you're not able to do your job. And I think that's a real problem. Sadly, I think some of this has to do with laziness. And we're all lazy, right? We're like, I don't want to do a thing that's hard, or I probably know this good enough, whatever. But what I've seen with a lot of these journalists is they've sort of just, this was hard, I'll just give up. I have one situation in particular where we took a so-called journalist on a hike in this forest that's planned to be logged. And of course, they're doing it under wildfire pretense logging, all that stuff. If you know me, you know I talk about this all the time because it's the Trojan horse for destroying public lands. Anyway, he said, I'm interested in the science. I was like, great, somebody who's actually aware of this stuff and can read studies and make sense of them. And so we took him out there. We had some experts in forest management, et cetera, et cetera. We gave them all the information from all of these studies, including the agency's own studies that contradict themselves. And then he didn't get back to me. I had to keep following up. He's like, yeah, sorry, I just don't basically know how to make sense of the fact that the industry and agency is telling me one thing in their science, and then there's all this other science. And so he just decided not to cover it at all. And that media outlet went on to ignore this topic for years until they decided to cover it with a vengeance and just put out nothing but disinformation and propaganda from the perspective of the logging industry and agencies. But anyway, the point is that even the journalist who said he has an understanding of this stuff just gave up on it. So is that laziness? I don't honestly know what that is. So that's why I'm asking you, inept or corrupt? So let's go into corrupt. So what is corrupt? Corrupt is knowing for a fact that you are only presenting one perspective or intentionally distorting information, misleading people, or putting out straight up falsehoods, or doing so in a way that you know it's probably false, but you don't take the time to check. And that is where media outlets have gone, primarily here in Colorado. And here's an interesting thing that happened that actually surprised the hell out of me. So I was able to uncover some emails, not illicitly, through something called the Colorado Open Records Act, which is CORA, which is like a FOIA or Freedom of Information Act for Colorado. And I was able to get emails that were on the public record between these agencies that log our public forests, including the U.S. Forest Service, and in this case, it was Jefferson County Open Space, and then Boulder County Open Space, all of whom are logging our public lands to pieces. I got these emails where these reporters would contact these entities because of press releases that we sent out. Now, we're sending out these press releases because these people are not following anything that's going on. The job of an advocate is to say, hey, here is my avenue. Look, this is something that we think is important. Will you do your job and get this to the public and or hold industry and government accountable? So it seems in these cases, they started to try to do their job, and they would contact these entities. One of them was basically saying, oh, look, there's a conspiracy. That's not true, right? So basically he set up a straw man to knock it down on its own. But these other two entities seem to have actually been accurately saying, this is a press release, and what do you think about this? And then what we have is we have these agencies either misleading, obfuscating, or stating false things, provably false things, basically saying, oh yeah, don't even worry about this. Those people are liars. We have 100% the truth. You shouldn't even cover this, basically. And that's what happened in all of these three particular instances. Way more than that happened. But the ones where I have emails, they earnestly, 2 out of 3, earnestly tried to look into it. The government agency said, don't even cover this. And they didn't cover it. And in fact, they pretty much in every case, they blacklisted me and my organization. They wouldn't even talk to me anymore because, hey, the government said we're lying. But just think about that in journalism. There is an advocate out there who, I mean, what do I get out of this? I don't get more money when we prove something, right? If anything, the more logging that happens, the more grant funding I'd get because there are more problems. But anyway, and then these agencies have clear conflicts of interest. So there's a member of the public, an advocate who you would think has some sort of track record, says, hey, this entity is doing something harmful. Look at it. And then the media is like, hey, entity, are you doing something harmful? And the entity is like, nope. In fact, they're bad. And media's like, oh, all right, case closed. I don't know if that's inept or corrupt. I'm not sure which that is. That is certainly bad journalism. I would say it's unethical. I would say it's lazy, but I haven't been able to figure that out. So here is the most distressing piece. I had put out a report that found a couple of those instances, and I didn't make a big deal out of those. I made the big deal out of simply look at how these agencies are lying to journalists. I didn't throw the journalists under the bus at that point. I said, oh, they were tricked, right? And then I put out this whole report. It's called Forest Fire Malfeasance, and it focuses on how these government agencies are provably lying to the public and media. As in, I have emails from behind the scenes through the same Cora stuff where they acknowledge that, all right, there is a conflict in the science, which is understating it. But they actually admit that. But don't say this publicly because it will seem like we've lost that debate. And you can go to forest fire malfeasance. It's on the coloradosmokescreen.org website. It's a page there that talks all about this and has all of that. And I was like, I got this admission behind the scenes that these entities that they're talking to that are telling them that they're completely legit are not, right? That they are at best falsifying some of this information or leaving some of this out or defaming folks like myself and conservationists. And I was able to get this report disseminated along with some other admissions by some of these same entities, basically saying there is a conflict in the science. And in fact, this logging is not going to protect communities. They admitted this stuff. And I was like, all right, this is going to be it, right? I've shown something that's pretty obvious, but now media can't be tricked anymore. And this was the test. Are they being tricked? Are they inept or are they corrupt? I put out that report. Since then, almost all media coverage has completely dried up on this topic. And then there's a handful of outlets that have already admitted they support the logging and they are putting out just propaganda, disinformation, just absolute falsehoods, not one-sided information, but just provably false information. And I am actually dealing with that behind the scenes. That's a discussion for another day. Anyway, so that's coming out into the world. I put that out publicly and to media. And instead of that fixing the problem, they've circled their wagons. So what that means is, even though I gave them this out of, look, you've been tricked, now you don't have to be tricked anymore, they've gone full on logging industry disinformation or complete cover-up, such as there has still, to this day, 2 years later, not been a single mention, not a single line in a single article anywhere in Colorado about the biggest logging project, it seems, in Colorado history, certainly of the century, this fake emergency logging that ties into this national picture, all this stuff in endangered species habitat, it's in roadless areas, all of these things that should make the news that are on their beats, they haven't even reported on it once. And at this point, I know for a fact that they are deliberately hiding information from the public. Now, the question is this because it's gotten too complicated for them to cover this? In other words, they're just not capable of doing their jobs. If that is the case, if they are more inept than they are corrupt, they have to get better at their jobs or they have to resign. Like, you can't be a media outlet that acknowledges that you can't do your job. You have to step aside. You have to hire people on who can actually do the job. If they are intentionally hiding this information, not because they can't do the job, but because they want to either protect these agencies, they just inherently trust every element of the government, which they certainly don't. Is it that it's a partisan thing where their political party that they favor is promoting this stuff? Guess what? It's both political parties. Is it that they've dug so deep a hole that they can't really save face, even though we gave them plenty of opportunities to save face? Basically, it comes down to, if this is a conscious decision that they are hiding this information from the public, then they are corrupt. Then they are not practicing ethical journalism. They need to be stepped down. They need to step down. And if they don't step down on their own, there needs to be journalism entities that point this out. Of course, I used to be a part of those, and they almost solely exist to protect their own rather than to improve it and to have accountability. The amount of polls that are out there where it shows media trust is like almost single digits is pretty much across the board. And yet never are they talking about, how did we lose trust? This is how. And so I have to then process this. If they are inept or corrupt, what does one do? If interfacing with them in all sorts of ways, from polite, hey, and come on out, and to a little more forceful, to then maybe calling them out publicly, none of those have really seemed to work. I'll tell you what has worked is basically about their experience level as a journalist, I found. It almost doesn't matter how I communicate this. It's just about where they are. I found that the newer reporters have not been brainwashed and have been not yet told, you don't cover this, you don't talk to these people, these are the people you talk to, and just leave that alone. So they're naive, as in curious, as in good journalists asking questions. Those are the folks who put out legitimate stories on these environmental issues. Even if they don't know all the pieces, they do a pretty good job of at least covering the bases. It's not usually very in-depth, but that's pretty good reporting as far as I'm concerned. The others are the grizzled old school journalists who are like, I don't care who this is going to upset, and whatever my own bias is, that's not why I'm here. Those folks do a pretty good job as well. But it's the folks who have a little bit of information that become these pure propagandists who are just doing damage to not just media and public trust, but participatory democracy as a whole. See, the way I frame all of this is that we have an industry out there in terms of environmental stuff, right? So we have environmental problems, and then we have an industry usually creating those. Then we have a government that's supposed to be managing that to a certain degree, which maybe in some cases is going to be finding a middle ground. Turns out they rarely, if ever, hold those entities accountable. In fact, they've just become handmaidens or partners in that, siphoning taxpayer funding to do public lands logging, grazing, mining, drilling, blah, blah, blah. And that role of government has basically been compromised. We all know that. None of this is controversial. Greedy industry and corrupt government. Yeah, duh. Media is there to hold industry and government accountable. And they're there to get information from the public and to the public. So they are that link in this chain of participatory democracy from industry, government, media, public, and then back from public, media, government, industry. And they have broken that chain. Bad media, poor environmental journalism has broken that chain of participatory democracy. That is why we cannot address these environmental issues, because media has failed us either through ineptitude or corruption. It doesn't even matter at this point what it is. What does matter is how do we address this? I think we should still try to be holding them accountable. I've put out these enviromedia report cards, which grade different topics like balance, objectivity, science, etc. They've not been very popular. No one likes them. I've tried to change up the format. I still think they're worthwhile. I'll keep tinkering with that. But I think there also needs to be an accountability through these journalism entities. They've just been pretty much useless, I have to say, almost hostile towards any improvement. So I don't really see the way forward with that. At this point, it's creating alternative media. And this means alternative not just to mainstream, but alternative to alternative, which has become just as bad. And I'm not just talking about social media pontifications or whatever I'm doing right now. I'm talking about it can be advocacy journalism, it can be balanced journalism on environmental topics by people who actually know what they're talking about. And they may have a bias, and so long as they are aware of their bias and honest about it, I think that's totally fine. Advocacy journalism balances things because pretty much everything is this industry government perspective. So we do need some pushback in that regard. But I would welcome, for sure, legit balanced journalism. And a place that's happening is on Substack. I have to say, I've been pleasantly surprised by Substack. It's social media for the literate, for people who write and read. And it's not just little clips or talking heads on podcasts, which, why waste your time with that, right? It's some legit information. And we have been dabbling in that at Eco Integrity Alliance. And I've been, like I said, pleased about that. People actually can process information there and seem to still have a little bit of attention span. Are you still listening to my podcast? Short attention span people. But I think it needs to be even more targeted. So that's why I'm just going to mention really quickly here that this is separate from Eco Integrity Alliance, but just as an example of what I think needs to be happening, I and 4 other people are starting up a dedicated environmental media outlet here in Colorado, and it's going to cover a broad brush of climate, land, air, water, and wildlife. And we have to replace the bad journalism that's going on in the state right now. It's just not being done. And it's certainly going to be a mix of advocacy, journalism, and opinion. And I'm going to try to do some balanced journalism as well. We have 5 different editors for those different bureaus. And we're also going to hold our state, local media accountable. We're going to do these report cards. We're going to be regularly reporting on their reporting. So we're finally going to have a place where it's going to be holding them accountable. We hope we can build this up enough. So see, what we're both doing is doing their jobs for them and pointing out how they should be doing their jobs better. And the ideal version of this is that they get the picture and start actually doing their job. Otherwise, we'll keep doing their job for them while beating up on them as need be, because it's time to take the gloves off. Media has been that broken link in the chain. They are complicit in the destruction of the natural world and the eco crisis. You almost can't blame industry for being industry. Government almost cannot be anything but corrupt. The way that they're held in check is by media, and media interfaces with the public and advocates. And right now, media is not doing that. They hate advocates. They are hostile towards us. They scorn us, and they'll even go so far as to defame us and to try to keep us out of the democratic process. So they have become the enemy. I hate to say it. I hate to be reductive in black and white, but I've been doing this a long time, folks, and I know how the sausage is made, and I'm pointing my finger at media. It's doing a bad job. I don't want to do their job, but I guess I have to, and you all have to be a part of this as well, which is you have to share this information. You have to engage with our stuff so it gets out there. You keep clicking on their sites and you're giving them ad revenue. I'd recommend stop paying attention to their information at all. You're getting dumber when you read their propaganda. Sure, if it's like, is it going to snow tomorrow? Or, oh boy, this was a car accident downtown. That's fine. But for anything else that ranges to the political or environmental or scientific or complex, they're not up to the job, or they're intentionally not doing their job well. We have to stop. We have to do things differently. This is our last chance to really engage in participatory democracy and address the eco crisis. And this may all be highfalutin nonsense and we're not going to accomplish anything. I don't know. Maybe I am just finding a way to feel better about myself and figure out what to do during my days here. But maybe there's more to it. If there is, we need your help. Please be a part of this. Please share this. Like, comment, subscribe, all that crapola that I hate saying, but we need you more. YouTube definitely does not show this to many people, and you can help. We're all part of this together. We need to get our act together better if media is. That's the other piece that I'll talk about another time. But anyway, thank you so much for listening to me ramble. Hopefully this was at least entertaining. I'm trying to make these somewhat entertaining. That's why I'm kind of getting into it. And I'm not there just like Sam Harris. Here's the latest fact and the interesting rebuttal. Like, I'm not doing that stuff. I do enough of that in the other podcasts where I pretend to be a normal person, and I'm polite to my guests because I want them to be the stars of that show. But for this is going to be me giving my unvarnished, for the most part, somewhat censored, I guess a little bit, opinion. And hopefully this is valuable to you. Tell me some topics you'd like, and I will possibly cover them if I like them and don't think I'd sound too stupid talking about them. But yeah, tell me what you think. Is media corrupt or inept or something else?